I mean, I'll tell you what, Amy, there's no more dismal way to live your life than in search of popularity. And this seems to be
Ugh.
all current. I see it on Facebook, like actually parents soliciting for tips on how their child can be more popular. Uh,
Oh,
what
it's sick.
what is that? But there is something about popularity that's interesting. Not popularity in terms of I'll do anything to be popular and
Well,
be.
some people do that, though,
Well, I
too.
understand that's the kind of the vacuous nature of popularity. Then there's the idea of popularizing a brand
Mhm.
or a product, a service, an innovation, and why some products and services and innovations and innovators are popularized and remembered well after their lives for their contributions, and some who made similar, if not perhaps more important contributions, are not so remembered. And so I was intrigued by this book called Hitmakers: The Science of Popularity in an Age of Distraction, which seeks to answer some of those questions about why some people are and items and services are popularized and why others are less so. And to help us explore this topic is Derek Thompson, the author of the aforesaid book, Hitmakers: The Science of Popularity in an Age of Distraction. He's also senior editor for The Atlantic. Derek, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Do we have Derek? Hello, Derek?
Maybe try right side.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh,
Yep.
there he
Oh,
is.
there we go.
Hey.
Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. So why don't we start with respect to your book? I mean, what you kind of do is lay out a number of examples of, why one impressionist painter has galleries at the Art Institute of Chicago and other impressionist painters don't, and other such examples where you've had people that make contributions in similar people, similarly situated, making similar contributions in their particular space, and one is remembered and celebrated, and another is not, and there's some lessons to be gleaned from those examples.
Yeah, I think the overall thesis of the book would be that, even though we live in a world where we think that we're enamored by newness and originality, and innovation was a word that you used, there's a sense that people want to constantly discover new things. But it turns out that what people really like is that which is familiar, or that which is sneakily familiar. We love new songs with familiar chord structures, or new movies sort of based on familiar characters. So in the chapter that you mentioned, I talk about how in the 19th century, there were a handful of impressionist painters, all of whom were sort of similarly popular, none of whom were particularly famous. But then one collector died named Gustave Caillebotte, whose most famous painting, Paris Rainy Day, is actually hanging right there at the Art Institute in Chicago. And he died, and the 7 painters that he happened to collect, which he bequeathed to the French government, were Manet, Monet, Renoir, Cézanne, Degas, Pissarro, and Sisley. They just happened to be the 7 core Impressionist painters. So what basically happened is history consecrated the Impressionist canon almost by accident. So familiarity leads to originality, but also distribution and exposure can beat quality of content.
Well, in your book, you mentioned that nothing goes viral, but there's viral videos every day.
So nothing goes viral essentially means that I think there's this idea that anything that seems to go big, anything that seems to become popular really quickly, we say it went viral, right? That video went viral. In disease research, viral means something very specific. It means that a disease, a fever, is passed between individuals, 1-to-1, 1-to-2, over and over and over again. But the way most information spreads online and offline is actually through broadcast. And so if you look at sort of the journey of a single video or a tweet or a Facebook post, you'll realize that it got big not because of a million one-to-one shares, but often because of a handful of 1-to-1 million moments. Maybe that it hit the front page of Drudge or the Huffington Post or Reddit, and you don't quite know that because you're maybe one Facebook share away from that broadcast. So I call it a dark broadcast. And I think that dark broadcasts matter more for online popularity than individual shares.
So some of this is happenstance, the impressionist example that you gave, and then there's these stories. I mean, I think of a flash of genius. That somebody gets basically the short end of the stick. Somebody gets taken advantage of, like that engineering professor Robert Kearns, who invented the intermittent wafer and had it taken essentially by the big auto companies. And somebody writes a script about it, and then he's kind of reintroduced and given credit where credit is due. So that's a little bit of the media providing a sense of justice. But in terms of if you're trying to popularize something, if you're a brand, a service, a personality, what's kind of the science behind that combination of the familiar with some kind of new angle to the familiar?
Right. Yeah. There's a long chapter where I write about the famous the father of industrial design named Raymond Loewy, who in the middle of the 20th century came up with this theory he called Maya, most advanced yet acceptable, MAYA, to explain how he was able to design incredibly popular consumer products for people sort of across the economy. But I also think that there's a lot of not only psychological lessons in the book, but also some sort of data science lessons as well. So, for example, let's say nothing goes viral and it's very difficult to sort of drop a video into the middle of nowhere and hope that people just spread it around. Well, that is a difficult proposition for someone like Facebook or Bumble, because in order for a social network to become big, it has to have a certain number of people already on it, right? Nobody wants to join a dating app that only has 10 people. So one way that these social networks have found ways to spread is by piggybacking off of offline networks. So, for example, digitizing an entire college campus, which is already connected, where the relationships already exist online, and essentially piggybacking off of those relationships, bringing an entire campus online all at once, and sort of using that to jumpstart your way to viral growth.
You mentioned, too, about how going back to politics a little bit, how President Obama and his speechwriters would think of themselves as songwriters because he is the best orator. I mean, how can you just explain that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. One of the most important critical features of music, according to musicologists, is this concept of repetition. I mean, just think about how unbelievably repetitive pop songs are. Not only their rhythms, but also their verses sound the same, the choruses repeat multiple times, and then, we put our favorite songs on repeat over and over again. Well, this same element of repetition is unbelievably powerful in speech, not only in famous Barack Obama speeches like Yes, we can, or Donald Trump speeches, Make America Great Again, but also within sentence structures. There's lots of Greek rhetorical devices, which are essentially repetition within sentences. So, for example, there's one called antimetaboly, which is a very complicated word, but basically just think of it as ABBA. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights.
That parallel structure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting in terms of how people kind of receive information and retain it. It's the Burma Shave jingles of sorts, right?
Oh, exactly. No, you can totally think of it as jingleizing public policy or jingleizing political ideas. And I think that there's a good and bad to this. As you guys mentioned, I think very, very astutely at the top of the show, that popularity is sort of mercenary, you could say. Sometimes what is popular is good, and there are reasons for it, and sometimes what is popular is bad. And when it comes to musical language, some of these sort of famous political slogans express beautiful ideas. Abraham Lincoln, government of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy is a wonderful concept, but there's lots of these famous political lines that have been used to hoodwink people, to be used as sort of cheap salesman tricks. And so throughout the book, I'm constantly trying to teach people, on the one hand, how to use the science of popularity, and then on the other hand, how to avoid it when you're on the consumer or the audience side.
Now, how do you explain something where, before the introduction of a product, people had no concept of it, right? So how do you popularize something that most people hadn't conceived? This is the innovator. It's kind of the old example of people in sub-Saharan Africa don't miss Mercedes Benzes because they don't have any concept of it.
Right, exactly.
What about addressing that conundrum?
This goes to the very heart of the first thesis of the book, which is that even as much as people living in modern cultures want to think that they are enamored by the new, they are most reliably enamored by that which is familiar, which means that tastes all over the world are naturally going to spread in 1,000 different directions because people are exposed to totally different styles of cars and music and food from an early age and develop entirely different tastes. So if you're trying to introduce a new product that's really, really surprising to a region that has no prior exposure to it, what you want to do is go back to that theory that I talked about from Raymond Loewy. MAYA, most advanced yet acceptable. To sell something surprising, you have to make it a little bit familiar. And technologists are really, really sensitive to this problem. Think about Steve Jobs talking about the first Mac computer, even in the movie with Michael Fassbender. He says, you have to make the screen look like a face. You have to make it say hello, right? To sell a consumer product that's totally new, you have to make it look like a friend. The modern analogy would be Alexa. Entirely new technology, AI. We don't exactly know what it is. It's alien a bit. But what does Amazon Alexa sound like? It sounds like a lilting female voice. An old-fashioned assistant, you could say.
Yeah.
So again, to sell a new, surprising technology, what they've done is to make it as familiar as possible.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's really interesting. I mean, it seems to be like a bit of a corollary in Harry Truman's old saw that there's nothing new in this world. It's just the history you don't know.
There's absolutely a sense of that. And, on the one hand, there's this idea that I think there's very, very fundamentally an evolutionary preference for the familiar. The evolutionary psychologist's explanation for this would be that if you're a hunter-gatherer sort of trawling the savannas of eastern Africa 100,000 years ago, if you see an animal or a plant that you recognize, that's a good sign that it hasn't killed you yet, so you should trust it. So there seems to be baked into our DNA, into our mammalian brain, a deep and inextricable preference for that which is familiar music and food and taste and technology. And this explains, why, old people are skeptical of Snapchat and why young people are skeptical of, boomer styles and boomer sort of ideologies. People like that which is familiar. And if you want to sell them something, figure out what their familiarities are, and then use their familiarities to build something new on top of it.
Oh, very interesting. Well, you've jarred our mammalian brains here. Derek Thompson, senior editor of The Atlantic, the author of the book Hitmakers, The Science of Popularity in an Age of Distraction. Really interesting read. Derek, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book.
Thank you so much.